Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to another HRO Today educational podcast. I'm Elliot Clark, the CEO of HRO Today. We publish HRO Today magazine, HRO Today EMEA, and HRO Today APAC, as well as produce the HRO Today forums and educational conferences held around the world, and we're the managers of the HRO Today Association. Today we're going to be talking about the Korn Ferry 2022 Talent Acquisition Trends Report. On your screen, you can see the URL to download the report. This is the first of two podcasts. We're going to talk about some of the labor market trends in this podcast, and then in the second podcast, talk about some of the things you can do with hiring managers and with your own organization's policies to help address and meet the changing labor markets as they are today. As you all know, Korn Ferry is one of the leading providers of recruitment process outsourcing services. They are one of the most highly rated providers on the HRO Today RPO Baker's Dozen customer satisfaction surveys and have been for as long as we've done the survey. So certainly Korn Ferry is a great organization to give you advice about labor market trends and how to work with hiring managers on them. Our two guests today, I'm very thrilled. We have two great experts joining us. We have Susan Della Vega, who is the Vice President of Client Experience for Korn Ferry. She's been with Korn Ferry for more than a decade and has supported some significant global brands such as PayPal, etc., and has worked with clients around the globe on large, complex talent acquisition, department operations, and solution sets. And we're also joined by Florencia Megy, who is the Vice President of Sales and Operations for Latin America. She's got about 6 years with Korn Ferry, and before that, a rich experience with a number of other providers, also working on very large, very complex solutions for global companies that are based in Latin America and global companies that have significant Latin American operations. So, Susan and Flor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Elliot.
All right, so let me get to the first topic. And we've all heard this term used in the media, the Great Resignation. Now, some of that may just be pent-up demand from people that did not want to change jobs during the pandemic. If there was the same amount of labor supply and demand, right, and bear with me on this one, ladies, this concern about musical chairs with people leaving one job, changing another, it wouldn't be a big deal when the music stopped. Everyone who got up would have a chair. Isn't the real underlying issue here talent shortage? In your 2022 Talent Acquisition Trends Report, you talk about some of these issues, but I want to look at some of those factors. How much of the talent shortage is due to people opting out of the labor force? How much is due to the over-specialization of job requirements? You know, you have good candidates, but they're not perfect, and the job specs are very tight. And how much is due to the unwillingness of employers to train or retrain employees to make sure they're up to date with current technical skill requirements? So I know I got three things. It's a big question. So let me go to Susan. Why don't you give us your perspective on, how much of this workforce shortage is actually a people shortage versus a talent shortage versus changing dynamics?
I think what we're seeing, and this really is a global challenge at the moment, so we're seeing this quite equally, I think, in every location around the world, which is unusual. We would typically see that there would be trends that may be more prevalent in some locations than others, but we are seeing this as global at the moment. I do think there is a percentage, and I'm going to go probably and say probably about 30% of the population at the moment are really opting either out of the workforce or taking less senior roles in the workforce. So from what I've been seeing, the pandemic has given people more time at home. On one hand, that can be positive. On the other hand, it's caused some burnout. And I think people have really reassessed their lives. They're opting out of some of the more pressured roles that they had. We're seeing a lot of remote working requirements at the moment. And there was actually, I think, a survey that just closed that Korn Ferry was running. And they're looking at the moment at 31% of the respondents want to be fully remote. And 55% of the respondents would like to spend 50% of their time in the office and 50% of the time out of the office. So I think we are seeing a good percentage of the population that is really opting out or opting down. I don't know if that's a phrase that I would use, but just taking a less senior role. We're certainly seeing that.
Now, Flora, I know your perspective is, you've got responsibility for Latin America, but you also have a number of global clients for whom Latin America is their headquarters or for whom a part of their operations are under your purview. Are you seeing the same kind of trends that Susan's mentioning as well?
Yes, certainly. There's nothing I see different in my region. And I would add that there's also, the expectation of hiring people who are ready to hit the ground running and a lot of specialization, especially in the IT arena, where we have clients. And just to give you an example, they say we want people with 15 years of experience in cloud. And I'm like, well, that's not really happening because 15 years ago, the cloud was something else. So there's a lot of requirements that don't have the actual workforce that is on demand at the moment. So that also creates a gap between demand and supply.
I recently saw a job listing out, and it was for truck drivers. Now, here in North America, we have a shortage of truck drivers, and not necessarily the kind of jobs that you might see in an RPO engagement, or maybe you would. And it said must have experience driving a Volvo in some kind of gearbox. And I'm thinking, how hard is it to teach an 18-wheeler trucker who drove Ford trucks the Volvo gearbox, right? So you think about that kind of ridiculous specification in a job listing, the must-have. What do you guys do with clients to sort of talk them off the ledge and get them to realize that, having the exact spec, and for our listeners who are practitioners in talent acquisition, what can we do to work with the hiring managers to get them to be more open to doing even a little bit of training?
Yeah, I think, it all starts off with a conversation, but conversation is theoretical, and we can come to them with specific data of what we see in the market in terms of how that delays the process, how that's going to delay the time to fill, which is their ultimate goal, to have it as quickly as possible. But I think at the end of the day, what they really need to see is the data pertaining to that particular position. And maybe it's because I'm not being very effective at talking about them, talking to it beforehand, but I need to go to with the data. I need to explain and show them, okay, these are your requirements. This is what we're finding in the workforce at the moment. There's clearly a gap, so something needs to be done to address it. And I think that once they see the data, which is like the Bible for us at RPO, they become more flexible.
I would say almost what we're seeing, Elliot, from the Great Resignation, whether we all believe that or not, right? I think it's almost perpetuating this problem of fixating on the perfect candidate, because what we're seeing is often people are understaffed, so they have less time to train, they have less time to upskill. And so the problem is being exacerbated by the current market. I think your question, it's absolutely not hard to train somebody, especially in some of these very fixed skills. What we're finding is often organizations see that, but when we get down to the hiring manager level, they're not. And again, they're the ones under pressure to deliver. So I completely agree with Flora. It's all about how do we show what the market looks like. We have access to a ton of IP and tools to be able to say, hey, if we have these narrow requirements, then your pool is going to be X percentage. If we were to take away, these two requirements, you're going to double or triple your pool size. Now, I will say it doesn't always work. What we're finding as well is that often the learning and development function over COVID wasn't invested in many organizations. So we're seeing again that compound that maybe there isn't the expertise internally to be able to provide this upskilling and training.
Yeah, and sort of at this point, it's a perfect storm because even the systems are rigged in such a way, when you think about it, that those candidates, because of the way ATS systems or applicant tracking systems do Boolean search or, various code term searching, they won't even turn up people unless they have the word Volvo, in my example of the trucker, in their resume. You also have the problem of the recruiting staff needs time to be able to dig to find the candidates in the system who might be those 90% candidates, but not 100%. Clearly, it's a significant problem. Let's talk a little bit about the talent shortage across all aspects of the workforce. Now, this is the first of two podcasts, and in our next podcast on this 2022 Talent Acquisition Trends Report, we'll discuss some of the strategies to address how to cope. In this one, we want to really set up the problem, but let's discuss how to manage diversity work goals in the current labor market. In your report, you talk about biases that obscure talented labor because the screening tools exclude qualified candidates. So, we know, some famous examples of bias that was built into selection systems, and obviously they've gotten a lot of press. We've covered it at HR Today, but how big a problem is this? And what do employers need to do to root out that bias? Because obviously DE&I is a big issue. And when they do root out the bias, it's going to reveal those labor markets. And how important will that be to internal mobility? So let's talk about that issue. What do you recommend to employers about this, and how do they reveal that talent pool?
I actually think it's an interesting one, Elliot, because I feel like hiring managers don't have a lot of tools at their fingertips to be able to really assess for potential. So it's almost some of the same challenges, right? There's this fixation on we must have exactly the person with exactly the skills. And I think that doesn't change when they look at an internal perspective. So they may have a bias towards, I've worked with Susan before, I don't know if she's got that skill set, there isn't the learning and development that sits there. But there's very few tools I think that organizations are employing to really understand what's that individual's potential? What could they do? Just because they haven't done that before doesn't mean they cannot. But how do we equip hiring managers, I think, to make unbiased decisions with potentially assessments? You're quite right. I think a lot of AI tools and Boolean searches look for specific skill sets. They don't necessarily look for adjacent skill sets. So I think one of our jobs as recruiters essentially is to challenge hiring managers differently to say, what's an adjacent skill set? Okay, so if they haven't worked in your exact field before, where else could they be working today? And why would they want to make that move? But I think we're seeing a lot of tools at the moment are creating that bias because, again, it comes back to this fixation on the candidate must be perfect, which unfortunately in a talent short market, it kind of doesn't help us. I think one other thing we're going to see, Elliot, is as we see here in the United States, more and more states bringing in vaccine mandates, we are potentially going to see representation impacted negatively because we do know that there are certain groups that have been impacted by the pandemic and also by choosing not to be vaccinated or being unable to be vaccinated. So I think that's going to cause more of a shortage and potentially further impact some of the representation goals that clients are really looking to achieve.
I just wanted to add that, I think at least in Latin, I'm going to be specific about Latin America for a second, but DE&I is in the agenda of everyone, every company, but I think it's still at the top level. It's not being walked so much as we'd like it to be. So I think that what you bring up is a real challenge in terms of, despite the assessments with no bias that the hiring managers might have access to, at the end of the day, if these managers aren't part of an organization that truly walks their talk in terms of DE&I, having an assessment that proves potential, if they are biased towards, previous experience or ex-college versus another, I think at the end of the day, the decision-making process is going to be biased. So I think it's a work in process and it will depend on different factors, company culture, training of all employees in terms of DE&I, generating general awareness.
We're actually doing a conference next year at HR Today on data science and HR because it's becoming such a big factor. If you look for people who are historically successful hires as executives over the last 10 years, you're going to get a more diverse population than if you go back 100 years. Go back 100 years, you're going to find that all executives are, white men. I think it's important for HR to really know what is in the queries that are being programmed into the artificial intelligence at a level of detail, the same level of detail they would take to actually looking at an EEO-1 or an OFCCP report here in the United States, or any diversity and inclusion report for any government around the world. Susan, and this is topical, we're hearing all kinds of things about vaccine mandates, and we know that in certain populations, particularly some of the populations of people of color, the vaccine is less appealing than it is in others. And different ethnic groups have different uptakes. There's different uptake between men and women. More women are vaccinated than men. There's a whole big debate going on about natural immunity. As companies begin to enforce these vaccine mandates, what are you advising clients about how to think about how it may adversely or even not adversely impact their hiring?
I think it's a sensitive situation at the moment because
I know I'm putting you on the spot. This is a podcast, Susan, not a walk in the park.
No, I hear you, Elliot. I'm up for it. I think there's two scenarios that we're seeing. One is where certain states are mandating that everyone within that state, must be fully vaccinated to be employed. So that's one challenge, right? Now, that is sort of a broader challenge where at least everybody in that state is in that scenario. But we're also seeing where clients are making a decision. We all know that social responsibility right now is also a huge topic and something I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. But we are finding that a lot of companies are taking their own stance. And it's a really difficult one to navigate because depending on, it can be very political, and depending on where somebody, sits, I suppose, on that spectrum, it can be extremely alienating for certain individuals, and they will choose not to go to an organization because of the mandate. And on the flip side, we're seeing, some companies where people are refusing to return to work. So I don't have the silver bullet on this one right now. And really, we try not to advise. We try to sort of look at facts and say, hey, here's the potential impacts of doing this. But there's also social impacts off the back of that. And there's a responsibility to other employees as well. So look, I don't think there's a silver bullet, Elliot, but it's going to be a really tricky one. And I think it's going to get more and more difficult over the next 6 months. I do know that, some of our clients they have a deadline of the end of this year. So that's going to be fascinating to see. Do they actually end up putting employees on, unpaid leave? Do they actually end up exiting employees who make the decision not to be vaccinated? I think it's going to be a really, really interesting case study. But I think either way, it's absolutely going to impact the talent shortage.
The point you made probably most that I hope the audience got is it really depends on your individual situation, your workforce, your population, and how they're receiving it. We know a few things from the science. The best hedge against getting COVID is to be vaccinated. I think sometimes companies need to think about how they're communicating because all of this concern comes from a good place, but sometimes the way these mandates have been rolled out has not been, from a leadership perspective, appealing to the associates. And I think that's important.
Some companies as well are in the position where they can be a little more selective, right? If you have a huge population, people are clamoring to work there, you potentially can take a couple more risks. And I think there's other organizations that I think it also depends on almost where you are in the pecking order.
These workforce issues, these are important labor dynamics that are taking place right now. Now, as I said a bit earlier, in this podcast, we're talking about here's the problem. It's the setup for the next podcast. We're going to talk about questions around the solution. So this is a two-part podcast. As I said, we're going to be discussing this 2022 labor trends report. I've asked a couple of hard questions, but I have great experts here from Korn Ferry's RPO group. As everyone knows who Korn Ferry is, and Korn Ferry's RPO group is one of the most highly rated RPO service provider, performing some of the world's largest and most complex deals. It's very highly rated on our HRO Today Baker's Dozen and has been for more than a decade. So I want to thank our experts, Susan Della Vega, who is the Vice President of Client Experience at Korn Ferry, and Megy, who's the Vice President of Sales and Operation for Latin America. Thank you, ladies, for taking part in the podcast.
Thank you, Elliot.
Appreciate it.
All right, and I'll look forward to having you back on the next one. This is Elliot Clark from HRO Today. Thank you for your time and attention, and we look forward to you joining part 2 of the 2022 Talent Acquisition Trends Report by Korn Ferry. And thanks for your time and attention to part 1.